I was born Nicholas Elliott Howard McCarthy Davis. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. When I was younger, my mother was very kind to me. She was a single mother, so she did everything she could do to take care of me. I remember one of the most amazing birthdays I ever had. I came home from school and the door was turned into the cover of a sewage pipe, and my birthday party was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle party. I was turning 5 years old, and it was one of the most amazing bashes I ever had. Sadly, it's one of the only positive memories I have of growing up. My mother was abused constantly by her boyfriends, and I used to be the person who would have to run and call for 911. I remember specifically we lived across the street from a set of duplexes that were pink, and to this day I have nightmares that I will go over to the duplex to bang on the door and have someone call 911 and no one's home, so I go next door and then next door and then next door, and the duplexes stretch on for miles. I was always so afraid that my mother would be murdered. I remember one time the TV show Cops came out to our house, and they were filming my mom because she had been beaten up. Luckily, my mother didn't consent to that being aired. The house where my mother's boyfriend constantly beat her up burned down, and we had to go stay with my grandmother. Now, my grandmother had took in one of my mother's sister's children and adopted him. He began molesting me when I was 3 years of age. I told my mother when I was about 7 or 8 that I was being molested. Her and my stepfather at the time didn't take it seriously, and unfortunately he not only went on to molest his brother and sister, but my 3 younger sisters. The youngest was 3 as well at the time. My mother was working at Columbia River Correctional Institution just outside of Portland, Oregon. It's a minimum security prison made famous by the escape of Diane Downs, the child shooter. My mother met a partner of hers who she went on to marry once she was pregnant with the oldest of my younger sisters. She married him and everything began to change. He would not only physically abuse her, but physically abuse me. And when he found out that I was not like other little boys, problems really began. Now, not only did I go from my mother being there for me every day and sleeping in my mother's bed even at 5 and 6 years old, to her marrying and kicking me out of her bedroom and changing my playroom into a den for my stepfather, but I was also constantly enduring molestation, so I began to act out in school. My mother decided to take me to a psychiatrist, and this is around the time that it was very popular for kids to be diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder and ADHD. I never spoke to this therapist. My mother had one-on-one counseling sessions with him, and he would prescribe me medications based upon what she would say. As these problems continued, they started to realize that I was a little different from other little boys. And one night I pierced my own ear. When my stepfather found out that it was the right ear, he beat me up, punching me and throwing me down the stairs. The next night I was brought to a psychiatric facility. And that's where my parents' crusade began. Parents meaning mother and stepfather. They began checking me into psychiatric facilities, saying that I had problems. However, once I would be put into these acute adolescent evaluation centers, they started to see that I had no behavioral problems. The reason being was I was very safe in those settings. No one was molesting me or physically abusing me. At one point, I was put into a 7 to 10 day evaluation program. My mother refused to come and get me when they wanted to release me 3 days early. I was stuck in there for 4 months until the police threatened to take my mother to jail for abandonment. And then she sent a big brother, big sister representative to remove me from the facility. When I was just entering my adolescence, I came clean to my mother and she knew that I was female. I also had started to develop breasts at that time, and she wanted to have them surgically removed. When I refused, me and my mother got into an altercation where she was choking me up against a dryer. Previously, she had thrown me out of a moving van after a psychiatric facility called her crazy and not me. She was having me against this dryer, choking me, and I, out of self-defense, punched my mother in the head. She called the police and I was arrested with an assault for her. That's the minorest charge, and you can get that for spitting on somebody. They placed me into foster care. I floated around from 3 to 4 foster homes, where I endured some horrific things. At that time, they decided to place me in a group home with many other children. And there was one kid in particular named Ryan who used to make a lot of fun of me. When they decided that it was unsafe for me to be in a group home or foster home facility due to my gender orientation, I was brought into the social service office where they gave me a bus pass and a map with an address to a kids' homeless shelter, told me to check in 30 days, and sent me to live on the streets of Portland, Oregon. On the streets, I met Cora, Ambrosia, and Odessa. They were 3 transgender / drag queens, and I had never met anybody who was living as a full-time female, and nobody who was as glamorous. Now, these girls, in hindsight, were very much bad news. They put me through lots of horrific experience, including forcing me to try to steal wigs, and then telling people that I was the one who did it so that I would be beaten up. They held me off the roof of buildings, and they forced me to go and to work in prostitution. It was a very horrific experience because the streets of Portland is no joke. Several kids have been lit on fire and murdered by street kids in Portland, and it was very hard for me. It became so dangerous for me, in fact, that from going from adolescent homeless shelter to day program, I would be escorted by staff from one center to another to walk the 3 and 4 blocks because there were so many people wanting to harm me. It was one of the scariest times of my life. And it all came to a head one evening when I was sleeping in the male dorm of a shelter that I had been in on and off for over 3 years. As I was sleeping, one of the kids, Ryan, from my previous group home, had noticed that I was in there. He proceeded to wake me up, gay bashing me, punching me with a fistful of rings, and trapping me between a beam and a window. He beat on me for over 20 minutes, fracturing every bone in the right side of my face and causing me to urinate all over myself. The staff were not even 10 feet away, and no one heard it. When I came out of the bedroom, my face was so swollen I couldn't even put my hands over it. When one of the staff returned from break, who happened to be homosexual, and saw what happened, he brought me into the office. Ryan proceeded to punch his pregnant girlfriend in the stomach and flee the building. When the police came out, they forced me to sit in my urine for over 45 minutes while I waited for a forensic photographer to come out and take photographs of my face. The next day, my friends had found out what happened, and they banded together. I remember specifically 2 radical fairies got me all the groceries that I could eat for my trip. I had sold some art in a program there called PAIR, Program Education, Art and Recreation. It was a drop-in center geared towards helping kids creatively, artistically express themselves while getting their GEDs. Every first Thursday of the month, Portland has free art shows in all the galleries in hopes that people will come out, enjoy the wine and cheese, and spend money on art. I actually happened to sell 3 pieces that first Thursday, so I had money coming to me. With that money, I bought a bus ticket down to San Francisco. Now you have to understand, I've always struggled with obesity, and at this time I was very much overweight. The only thing that I had going for me, in my opinion, the only source of self-confidence was my face. So as I traveled down from Portland, Oregon to San Francisco, I felt like a monster, a hideous beast. And I remember arriving into the city and getting off the Greyhound bus, following the directions from my friends to meet one of their mutual friends who happened to live in San Francisco. I was alone, I was in a new city, and I wasn't even 18 years of age. I got into the subway system and came out on the Castro. The Castro in San Francisco has one of the largest gay flags you could ever see. And looking up and standing within its shadow, I began to sob. I realized that I was in a safe place, and that no matter what I was going through, no matter how disfigured I was at the time, no matter how different I was from where I had come, I knew that I was safe, and I knew that I had a new beginning. I made my way to the Larkin Street Youth Center It was an organization, a nonprofit geared towards helping street youth of all kinds. And there I found open arms in the staff and in the youth that were in their center. I was not even 18, and I went to their overnight shelter called Diamond. I made it a point to start completely new. I made all the friends I could, and I still have lasting fond memories of those times. Once I became 18, I had volunteered at the Castro Street Fair, and unbeknownst to me, a couple weeks later, I got a check for $125. I decided that I had never been anywhere else, and I had no permanent place to live, so I headed to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, California, where I could see the Walk of Fame. Yet again, alone, penniless, and shelterless, I'm wandering the streets of Hollywood, California. I discovered Santa Monica Boulevard, a tranny prostitution stroll. It became famous in the 90s when Eddie Murphy was busted picking up a prostitute that he later claimed he didn't know was transgender. I met a lot of girls, and I started to experience the harder side of being transgender. It wasn't too long until I was prostituting myself to survive. I later found one of the most amazing people who I would ever know. Her name is Vanessa, and to this day I am very close to her. I consider her my true mother. She took me out of prostitution and took me in under her wing. She fed me, she gave me a place to stay, and she made sure that I was safe. However, I did engage in unhealthy activities. I was using drugs, and I was in a very difficult emotional state. It's very hard when you have no family and no friends, and the one person who is taking care of you, you don't think you can trust because everything you went through. Not long after that, Vanessa was arrested for crimes that I don't need to talk about, and I was left on the streets. A Discovery Health Channel network documentary was being filmed, and that's when they would take their time to share part of my story on transgender teens. At the end of the documentary, they made it seem like I was dead, and in fact, I was dead inside. I was so tired, I was so drained, and I was so sick of allowing myself to engage in harmful drug activity. I shaved my head and I moved to New Orleans. I fell in love with the Big Easy, and a couple weeks later it was pouring down rain. I saw a homeless gentleman about 75 years of age spit on the concrete. A police officer came up to him and went to write him a ticket. It's illegal to spit on the ground in New Orleans. He said to the cop, "But it's raining." And that cop pulled out a billy club and beat the man till he was nearly unconscious. Then he grabbed him by the shoulders and threw him in the back of a cop car. I love New Orleans, but I saw the Jim Crow laws there firsthand, and I felt completely unsafe. So I entered a research study where I was in the program for 2 weeks and made $2,000. I took that money and I went back to San Francisco. Back in San Francisco for a short time, I checked into the Lark Inn, different from Lark Inn Street for Youth. The Lark Inn is an 18 and over adult program. From 18 to 24 in San Francisco, you are still considered a minor, and therefore you're entitled to the homeless youth shelters. I was in that program for a very short period of time because a cleaning lady who did not feel comfortable with who I was made an allegation that I blocked her in the hallway, and they considered that a threat. However, you have to imagine that I was well over 300 pounds, and that hallway was very narrow. They said that I blocked her and she felt unsafe, and I was kicked out onto the streets, where I went and decided to live on the beach, and there was only so much of that I could take. I had a boyfriend at the time, and he punched me in the face. After I defended myself physically for the first time ever in my life, I decided it was time to make a change, and I went back to Oregon. Back in Portland, I had went home, as I am, as the woman you see before you. My mother was infuriated. She began to chase me. I ran from the house, carrying a caboodle full of wigs and shampoo and a makeup box in the other hand. As my mother jumps into her Lincoln Navigator, I'm literally running down the block. A red Corvette pulls over, and I say, "What?" The man is speaking to me, and I'm so full of adrenaline, I couldn't even understand what he was saying. He let me know that I dropped a bottle of shampoo. I jumped into his car, and I screamed at him to drive. He began to speed as my mother literally was chasing him. We hit a corner, and she did, going on 2 wheels, and we're speeding down Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. As I continue to run with this man, he says to me, "Hey, I have a DUI and I have a bottle of beer in the back of my car. Is that the cops?" I realized that my mother was chasing me and there was nothing I could do. I just told him to drive. Finally, he lost her. As he pulled into his grandmother's driveway, he turns to me and he says, "You have a deep voice." Everything stopped. It was as if an hour passed, and it was yet a blink of an eye. I'm in some man's car. I am transgender, and this man is someone who I don't know. As I go to respond, he says, "My mother has a deep voice. I love black women with deep voices. All black women got deep voices." We went inside and his grandmother had cooked a soul food dinner. I took a plate and I bounced. After that incident, I realized that Portland wasn't the place for me. I tried to go back to the streets for a brief period of time and I was just too scared. But I met a girl named Lexi, and she was a little different. She was born with a deformity where on one hand she had a wrist and 3 very small Skittle-sized fingers. I convinced her to open a bank account and we used it to fly to New York City. No money in our pocket. We arrive in New York and have no money to get out of the airport and onto the subway. A really nice woman let us ride in her cab, and it was one of the fastest car rides I have ever experienced in my life outside of my mother's grand chase. I arrived at Ground Zero because she was there on business regarding 9/11. We then walked for what seemed like miles until we figured out where the Covenant House was. When I went through the intake process and I revealed that I was a transgender, they wanted to put me with the men, or boys, I should say, and I, yet again, told them that I am a female and I deserve to be in the female side. Within 2 weeks, the girls had ganged up on me. One of them was named Cinnamon, one of the evilest creatures that I have ever encountered. And of course, the staff there decided that it was my fault for unsettling the environment, and they asked me to leave. I found myself attending a support group for transgender youth not so long after that. That's where I met Jocelyn. She is a person who I consider my godmother. Jocelyn came to see me one evening and realized that I was sleeping literally on the floor. She then did something that no one had ever done for me. Previously, she was trying to access a women's shelter in New York City when she was homeless, and they informed her that as a transgender woman she had no rights. She stood up for herself and got awarded $50,000 for her mental pain and anguish. She took that money and checked me into the Ramada in New York City. Staying in the hotel, she made a life-changing decision to leave her low-income housing and to get an apartment with me and my brother at the time, and still my brother to this day, Joey. Me, her, and Joey got our first apartment, and not too long after, my sister Alasia, who I had first met at the Covenant House, came to live with us as well. As the relationship progressed between me, Jocelyn, and Alasia, a house full of feminine energy became too much for my brother, and he decided to move out on his own. While staying with Alasia, it was my first time being stable for a long time. I began to relive everything that I went through on the streets. At just 24 years old, I was having chest pains every day. Feeling like it was a symptom of my anxiety, I continued to ignore it until finally I was so much in pain, I decided to go to the emergency room, expecting them to come back and tell me that I was having a panic attack, I found out that I had a blood clot in my lung, also known as a pulmonary embolism. This blood clot had traveled there because I had been so mobile for over a year that my legs had gathered blood in them, which had clotted and traveled up my artery into my lungs. After spending much time in the hospital, I had no health insurance, and I realized that returning back to California would enable me to get public health care. After me and Jocelyn arrived, I met a guy named Joe. Returning to San Francisco, Jocelyn was deciding that she wanted to live on her own, and I was taking it to the next level with my boyfriend Joe. So we decided to get an apartment of our own, and we moved out to Alameda, California. Upon embarking into our apartment together, I was still very much overweight. At this point, I was 375 pounds. I became critically ill. I ended up spending over 2 weeks in the hospital. I was diagnosed with DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis. What that means is that when I had passed out and the ambulance came, they asked me if I was a diabetic, and of course I wasn't, to my knowledge. They checked my blood sugar. The machine just said high. HI. It was unable to read how much sugar was in my blood. Once the lab work came back, it was well over 700, and my weight was well over 375 pounds. I was taking over 150 units of short-acting insulin a day. I was taking over 190 units of long-acting insulin a day, and I was on 2 diabetic pills and 3 blood pressure medications. At 27 years old, I realized if I didn't make a drastic change, this would be the end of me. Clicking onto YouTube and seeing all the people who had went through gastric bypass, I knew that something had to be done. I was on government-issued insurance, and I had the ability to try to start the process. I was terrified of surgery, and I had known that I would not follow through if it would take a long time. So I decided to push for my surgery, to push for my life. And in under 3 months, I was on an operating table where Alta Bates Summit Bariatric Surgery Center and the wonderful Dr. Teresa Kim performed the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass on me. 9 months out of surgery and 140 pounds lost, me and my partner, Joe, broke up. It was a tumultuous breakup where I and him decided that it was best for us to go our separate ways. At this time, I had reconnected with my brother Jeremy from the Castro Youth Housing Program, and he came to live with us. Joe decided to move down to Pismo Beach, California, and me, Jeremy, and my dog packed up our belongings and moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, of course, this was a very abridged version of my story. My story would take way too long to tell you in such a small video. But the point is this: I am now in Atlanta, Georgia. I am over 150 pounds lost. At 5'11", I just weighed myself at 219 pounds, a far cry from 375.